If you know much about me, you know that I like to spend as much time as possible on the golf course. And most of the time when I play, I have a kind of a crew, a group of friends and family who I always play with. But on occasion, I get the chance to play with somebody who I've never met. They haven't met me. I don't know them. Getting to know people is part of the game of golf. You know, if you're a group of four of you go out and play together, then you're going to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.5 hours with the other three people you're playing with, which means that by the end of the day, even if you started out as strangers, you're going to have learned a relatively decent amount one another, and you're going to be fairly well acquainted. And while I'm pretty much an open book, there is one topic that I really try to avoid for as long as I can. Because once we broach this one topic, the tone of the social atmosphere, so to speak, drastically changes. There was one particular Saturday when I had been invited by two of my good friends who I play with all the time to go and play a round of golf with them. But instead of rounding out our foursome with one of our regulars, they told me that they were going to be bringing a friend from work that they knew, a guy who I'd never met. That's perfectly fine by me. But I also, in that moment, had a pretty good idea of how the social dynamics were going to play out way before I ever met this guy. Now, it's important to know that the friends who I was playing with, they're good Christians, all right? They don't get belligerently drunk on the golf course. They don't yell four-letter words at their golf ball every time it doesn't go where they want it to. They don't gamble their life savings away, trying to win a few bucks. They don't do any of those things. All of which are, unfortunately, maybe more common than you might think if you're not a golfer. They say golf's a gentleman's game, and there are a lot of really fine folks who play the game honorably and do that sort of thing. There's a lot of guys who think it's an excuse to drink beer and tell dirty jokes, okay? So you get a little bit of a mixed bag. Now, my friends were the good Christian type of golfers. They didn't do those sorts of things. But the guy they were bringing with them, a little bit of a different story. Now, he wasn't a full-blown, crazy, degenerate guy, but it was pretty clear that he did not share the rest of the group's Christian values and ethics and morals. He believed that his ball responded best to four-letter words, and so he used them. He thought that, he was friendly, he made conversation, which was great, tried to get to know me, but part of how he made conversation was by cracking jokes and telling stories that are not exactly the kinds of things you should say really in anybody's company, but certainly polite company. And I'm not sure that he probably got an idea pretty early on that, something was different about the rest of us, that I'm sure he noticed that the kind of, terms I used to try to encourage my golf ball were not the same as his. And I'm sure he noticed that the jokes that I made were different than the ones he made. And I'm sure that he noticed that a few of the topics he tried to engage me with, I didn't really engage with. But none of that really seemed to give him any second thoughts about anything he was saying or doing at all. He continued right along, kind of speaking however he liked, speaking to me however he liked, until, that is, he asked a question that completely changed how he saw me and how he treated me. Now, somewhere about halfway through the day, this is, 2.5-ish hours into the round, he and I are standing to the side talking while our two playing partners are finishing up the hole, and we're going back and forth. And then he asked me the question that I knew was coming all day long. And I knew that once I answered his question, it was going to completely change how we interacted from that moment forward. And this big, huge, earth-shattering question was this. He said, hey, what do you do for a living? Well, pretty benign question. Here's the problem. I knew it was bound to come up, 4.5 hours with somebody new, you're getting to know one another, you're probably going to get asked, what do you do for a living? But I always hope that doesn't come up too early, because if it comes up too early, that really changes things. Up to this point, the atmosphere, the vibe of the group, you could let your hair down a little bit, that sort of thing. However, after he asked me this question, I knew the moment had come where I was going to have to share my little secret with my new friend. And so when he asked what I did for work, I answered him honestly. I said, I'm a full-time pastor. I work at a church. Now, I don't remember his exact response verbatim. What I do remember is that it started with a four-letter word, followed by something about how he was going to have to cut down on the expletives for the rest of the day. And he did. For the rest of the day, he changed his language, he changed his behavior, his demeanor towards me, his jokes changed. Something had clearly shifted in his mind about how he should be speaking to me and what behavior was acceptable around me and towards me. And from then on, if he was going to say profane things, he said them a little bit quieter or to himself so that I couldn't hear. If he was telling a joke, he tried to clean it up a little bit. And certain topics just kind of didn't seem to come up much after that. All of which weren't necessarily bad changes, but it was pretty evident that this guy had significantly adjusted his behavior now that he knew that there was a pastor in the group. It was obvious that he believed that Lucas, the pastor, was to be treated with an entirely different level of respect and deference and dignity than Lucas, the guy who likes golf, was supposed to be treated with. Now, that is one of the reasons that I don't volunteer the information that I'm a pastor to people I'm getting to know on the golf course right away. Not because I want to hear obscenities all day long and I want to hear dirty jokes, but because if you tell them you're a pastor, they turn into a different person. You don't get to know people with their guard down at all if they know that about me from the first thing. Now, the amusing part of this is that this switch happened halfway through the day. This is 2.5 hours in. I'd already gotten to know what this guy's favorite 4-letter words were when his ball didn't do what he wanted. I already knew that his kind of jokes had a little bit of edge to them. I had already figured all of that out. But now, very suddenly, he felt the need to put a stop to that, to treat me differently after finding out my title, my position, what I did for work. So the question is, why the change? Why are the 4-letter words just fine 1 minute and not the next? Why are the jokes good 1 minute and not the next? I, as an individual, I didn't morph into a different person when I told him what I do for work. I hadn't changed. Nothing that I had done in that moment demanded an elevated level of respect or deference. I just told him what my job was. But it was clear that he believed that I was now in a different category. I had been moved from one category where he could say and do those things around me to a different category. He said, you don't say those kind of things around a pastor, because Lucas belonged in one group and pastors belonged in another group. And all of a sudden, certain behavior towards me was unacceptable. Because there are some things you might say in front of a golfing buddy that you should not say in front of the preacher. And the switch was clear to see. And on one hand, I appreciated it. I appreciated him cleaning up his act a little bit. But the problem was, in doing that, he revealed that he was making a pretty serious mistake in how he treated people. And the mistake that my friend was making was he had divided people into these two groups. These two groups of people. For him, there were two groups of people on the course that day. One group that said, you can kind of speak to these people and, your behavior around them, whatever, it doesn't really matter. You can treat them however you want. That was one group of people. And then there was another group of people that they deserved a elevated level of respect and deference and deserved to be treated with dignity that these folks didn't necessarily deserve to be treated with. And again, when he realized I was a pastor, I got moved from one group to the other group. And I appreciated, his behavioral changes for the most part. But the motivations behind that change were wrong and they were dangerous. In the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty minor issue when this sort of stuff happens on a golf course, and the worst mistreatment that anybody suffers is having to hear a few expletives and hear some colorful jokes. But when the practice of sorting people into these two different groups extends beyond the golf course, it becomes not just a minor offense, but the basis for an unjust society. And you can see that happening all around. You can see the effects of dividing people into these two groups, one group who you can treat however you want, and another group who you have to treat with respect and dignity. You can see the effects of that everywhere. That's why people will cuss out and they will belittle a McDonald's drive-thru worker in ways that they would never, ever speak to some sort of high-powered, Harvard-educated lawyer. It's the same reason that if you've got the right last name, people will make sure to never offend you. They will never say anything bad to you or wrong about you. And if you have the wrong last name, there is nothing they will not call you. It's because they're sorting people into two groups. You can look and see this happening everywhere. You can see people putting the folks that they like, the folks that they need, the folks that have something to offer them, the folks that are powerful and can either help them or hurt them. They go into the group that says, hey, we've got to treat these folks well because I stand to gain or I stand to suffer if I don't, or there's something they can do for me. And at the same time, they take everybody else and shove them into the other group and say, you can treat these people however you want because I don't like them, I don't need them, I don't think they're deserving of it, they can't help me, they did something wrong against me, and so I'll treat them however I think they deserve to be treated. There's no bottom line for what you can do to these people because they're unimportant, they don't matter, and you don't need them. And what my friend and everyone else who sorts people into those groups fails to realize is that in all reality, this group doesn't actually exist. Not that the people don't exist, but there is not an option in a category for treating people however you please. That's not a real option. Because what demands people be treated with respect and dignity is not a title, it's not a position, it's not a last name, it's not any of those things. What demands that people may not be put in a group like this is that this common trait that every single person shares, every one of us, and this common trait has nothing to do with what we think of them or what they think of us or what they can do or can't do. This common trait, this thing that qualifies everybody to be treated with a certain level of respect and dignity is, of course, the image of God. You see, the lost world says, treat the people you need, treat the people you like, treat the people who can give you something back, treat those people well. But everybody else, treat them however you want. They can't help you, they don't matter, you don't need them. So you're free to do as you please. That does not work in the kingdom of God. In the kingdom of God, we say, well, of course, it's easy to treat people well who treat us well. Of course, you're going to respect those who respect you. Of course, you're going to scratch the back of people who scratch yours. But God says when image bearers are involved, there is not an option to treat them however we please. There is a baseline level of respect. There is a floor that says every single image bearer must be treated with this level of dignity and respect at all times. And today we're going to see how the fear of the Lord directly and has everything to do with this baseline treatment that is owed to all image bearers. Because so far in this series, we've seen how the fear of the Lord changes our relationship with God. We have seen it changes how we see Him, how we interact with Him, how we approach Him, how we obey Him, all of those things. But the fear of the Lord also directly impacts how we see and how we treat one another. The lost world says you can put them in these two categories, treat those however you want. But for those who fear God, there is no room for mistreating those who are made in His image, regardless of our opinion of them, what they can do for us, what they have done to us. There is no room for that. And that leads us to this first principle. Those who fear the Lord treat all those who bear His image with respect and dignity. Those who fear the Lord treat all those who bear His image with respect and with dignity. The fear of the Lord changes the way we interact with other people because those people bear the image of the God whom we fear. That's what's happening. And if we fear God, then we are not free to do as we please to those who are made in His image. The connection between the fear of God and our conduct with one another is something that I know at least I don't often find at the front of my mind. I would think probably most of us don't often think of this connection. It's not in the front of our heads. But even when we fail to recognize it, it is a crystal clear link between the fear of God and how we treat others. And just to give you a few really clear and obvious examples, it's all throughout Scripture. In Leviticus 19, in this relatively lengthy passage, and we're not going to read the whole thing, but God is explaining to His people, He's saying, here's how you love your neighbor. Here's how you treat other image bearers. Here's what it means to, with dignity and respect, even those who can't add anything to your life. God says this, Leviticus 19:14, He says, you shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. He says, just because the deaf guy can't hear you, you can't say whatever you want to him. And just because the blind guy can't see you getting ready to trip him doesn't mean you can trip him. They're image bearers. You can't do that to them. Why? He says, but you shall fear your God. That's why. Leviticus 25:17. God is giving instructions to us again, and He says, you shall not wrong one another. But why? You shall fear your God. You cannot wrong one another. You cannot mistreat one another. Instead, fear God. A little farther down in Leviticus 25, verse 36, God says, don't financially prey on your brother. When misfortune befalls him and he comes to you, do not try to extort him or make a profit out of him. Don't do that. But instead, fear God. A little further down, the same chapter, verses 42 and 43 of Leviticus 25, God says, if one of your brothers becomes destitute, loses everything, and he sells himself to you as a slave, which was a common practice back then, it was a form of bankruptcy. But He says, your brother comes to you, sells himself to you as a slave, you are not free to rule over him ruthlessly. Why? Because you fear God. and that brother of yours is made in the image of the God that you fear. So you may not treat him like that. There's this whole list of you may not do this, you may not do this, you may not do that, you may not do that. And why you may not do any of those things is because if you fear God, then you are not free to treat the people who are made in his image like that. They're off the table. It's not an option. Over and over and over again, fearing God is given as the reason that we may not mistreat our neighbors. And when we consider how the fear of God interacts with how we treat one another, I think it gives sort of new light and new dimensions to a passage like Ecclesiastes 12:13, where God says to us what the whole duty of man is. Now, it's important to know that the guy writing this, inspired by the Holy Spirit, but Solomon is writing this. Solomon is considered the wisest man who ever lived. And he looked high and low, left, right, center, under every rock, trying to figure out the meaning of life and what the duty of man is and what life's all about and how we're supposed to live in light of it. And he gets to the end of Ecclesiastes, and Solomon writes this. He says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Solomon's saying, all right, I've exhausted myself trying to figure this out, trying to figure out what life's about, trying to figure out what we're supposed to do, and here's what I come up with. At the end of it all, fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. Now you might be thinking, well, Lucas, that didn't say anything about how we treat people at all. And you're right, on the surface at least. Here's the catch. 6 out of 10 of the 10 commandments are about how we treat other people. 60%. And we just hit several other passages that are part of these bigger passages where God is giving us commands about how to respect and treat other image bearers with dignity. Which means that a huge portion of fearing God and obeying his commands involves how we deal with people. And when I read that verse and I consider that this is talking about, what the end of man is, the chief duty, what we're supposed to be doing, I can't help but thinking of Jesus' words in the New Testament where he's kind of answering a similar question about what the chief duty of man is, the whole duty of man. And Jesus says this in response to a question. A guy comes to Jesus and he says, what's the greatest command? Now, it's helpful to know that when this guy asked Jesus that question, this was not an innocent question. All right? This was a Pharisee and he was a lawyer and he was sick of hearing Jesus go on and on and on, and he wanted to trap Jesus in a trick question. And so he comes to Jesus and he says, hey, if you're so smart, why don't you tell me what the greatest command is? Now, here's the reason that's a trick question. Because as soon as you say, well, this command is the most important, it's this one right here, guess what you've done to all the rest of the commands? You said this one's really important, which means these are kind of minor ones. They're not as important. God didn't really mean it as much when he gave these as he did when he gave that one. And so this guy thinks, I've got him. Because as soon as Jesus says it's that one, then you open the door to say, well, you can just pick and choose whatever one you like. You don't like this one? We'll put it in the minor pile. Say, God didn't really mean it. That's not one of the important ones. These are the important ones. I like these. I'll abide by these, but those are less important. Well, that's an enormous can of worms and a mess. And so this guy thinks, Jesus can't answer this question. If he does, then we'll know that he is a liar and all of the things we think he is. But Jesus does not dodge the question. He gives this guy a straight answer without diminishing anything that God has said. It says, and he said to him, Matthew 22, this is Jesus said back to this Pharisee, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And then he says, and there's a second that's just like it. Second that goes right along with it, hand in hand. And it is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And why are these the great commands? He says, because on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. If you get those two right, you're going to get the rest of them right. So those two. Ecclesiastes says the whole duty of man is to fear God and obey his commands. Jesus says the whole duty of man is to love God and love neighbor. Those passages do not stand in opposition to one another. They work in harmony perfectly. Jesus is building on and fleshing out what is said in the Old Testament. He makes it clear here that love and fear are connected, and that fearing God, and loving your neighbor are all tied up together. They have always been tied up together. Jesus is just helping us to see that in a richer and fuller light. And he also helps us to understand what it looks like to honor the image of God in our fellow man by loving our neighbor. But before we go on to that and talking about how Jesus teaches us to treat others, I want to be clear here about what loving your neighbor does not mean, what it does not look like to love your neighbor. Because our current culture has completely hijacked the word love. They've hijacked it. They have hijacked what it means to love somebody. And so just to be clear, what it means to love your neighbor, that does not mean that you have to agree with and cheer on every decision that somebody makes. It does not mean that you cannot hold other people accountable for bad behavior or sinful actions. And it does not mean that you can only say nice things to people that are never going to hurt anybody's feelings. That is not what Jesus is having us to do by loving our neighbor. It also, when we talk about treating everybody as valuable and as image bearers, it does not mean that you can't acknowledge that there are certain people or accomplishments or positions that deserve a heightened level or our highest level of respect and regard and admiration. Our respect and the deference that we pay towards the President of the United States should be different than that we pay to the President of the HOA. Those are different things. And that they do not go, just because you treat the President of the United States with a higher deference and with more respect does not mean that you are not treating the other guy as an image bearer, okay? You can do that. But what we're saying is there is a floor, there is a baseline that you may not go below that says everybody are owed this level of respect and this level of dignity because they bear the image of God. And so what loving your neighbor means is when you intervene on somebody for bad behavior, when you do that, you can still intervene on them. You can still hold them accountable. When you do it, you cannot verbally abuse them in the process of doing that. Because even though they're in the wrong, they're still an image bearer, and it doesn't give you the right to say it however you want to say it to them. You cannot verbally eviscerate them. It means that you have to treat others as equals and as valuable, even when they disagree with you and when they will not treat you like that in return. And it means you got to be willing to make sacrifices sometimes for the sake of others, even if they wouldn't return the favor. That's what being a person who fears God does, and that's what loving your neighbor looks like, and that's where it begins. That begins with fearing the Lord. It begins with the fear of God, because those who fear the Lord treat those made in his image with respect and dignity. And that's why the lost world has a hard time doing this. It's why the lost world has a really hard time consistently loving their neighbor well. It's why those who are far from God end up sorting people into these two groups and mistreating all kinds of people. Because if loving your neighbor starts with fearing God and you skip step one, you skip the whole fear of God thing, step two is going to be shaky at best. Because if we think very little of God, then we are free to think very little of the people who are made in his image. However, if all of that's true, and it is, it begs the question, why is it that at least some lost people who look like they're doing a pretty decent job of treating others with kindness and dignity and respect and looking out for one another? If it's true that we can only love our neighbors consistently and can love them well if we fear God, then why does it look like some people who are certainly not God-fearing people are treating others with respect and dignity? I think the answer to that question lies in the word consistently. As we've talked about and referenced, there are other motivating factors that can spur us on towards at least treating our neighbors lovingly some of the time. There are other motivations that can do that for us. For instance, a lost person can treat a family member who they despise. They cannot stand this person. They despise their existence. But they can treat that person well as long as it means they're going to stay or get written into the will. It's another motivation. You know, there are lost people who will bend over backwards. They will make great sacrifices, go to great pains, really just go out of their way to do favors for people as long as they think they're going to be able to call in those favors one day. As long as they're going to be able to call that guy and say, hey, you owe me one. There are lost people who will even go and take care of the poor and the powerless and the destitute, and they will look out for those people so long as somebody is watching them do it. And so long as they get the credit for being a loving person who cares about the people that nobody else cares for. There are ulterior motives that can make this happen in some places 4 times. But here's the problem with all those other motives. Eventually, they're going to let you down. And eventually you're going to end up mistreating all kinds of people. Because what is happening is you're still sorting people into two groups, and you're free to move them here and there wherever you want. Because if you're only treating the poor and the powerless and the trampled on well when somebody's watching, what happens whenever nobody's watching? You take them out of the respect group and put them over here, and you can treat them however I want group. You can move them as you please. Sometimes over here, sometimes over there. There's still no bottom line for these people over here. And so those motivations, they don't really work. They do not consistently lead you to a place where you're going to love your neighbor and you're going to treat them with respect and dignity all the time, no matter what. It doesn't work. Supposedly doing, good things or doing supposedly good things for the wrong reasons, it never really works out. Because your motivations matter when it comes to loving your neighbor. And your motivations are eventually going to find you out, and they're going to become clear to anybody who's watching. And in the kingdom of God, the bar is much, much, much higher than it is in the lost world. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells us how loving our neighbor because they're an image bearer is supposed to work. He says this, "You have heard that it was said," this is Jesus. He says, "You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." That's what the lost world says. But Jesus, he says, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? The lost world says you love those who love you. The lost world says you look out for the people who are going to look out for you. The lost world says as long as you stand to gain something, you can help those people because they're going to do something for you in return. Jesus says that's not good enough. And do you want to take a guess at why it's not good enough? Because in the kingdom of God, there is no room for that sort of sorting people and the people who hate us. Even the people who hate us, the people who persecute us, the people who don't like us, who don't treat us well, even those people bear the image of the God whom we fear, which means that we are not free to treat them however we want. We are not free to hate them back. We are not free to treat them with disdain. We are not free to write them off. You don't have to be best friends with them. I'm not saying that. But there is a baseline level of respect and dignity that even those people have to be treated with because they bear the image of the God who we fear. And if we fear God, we cannot turn around and mistreat those who are made in his image, even if they mistreat us. Jesus goes on, Luke 14, and he says this. Jesus gets invited to this banquet, and while he's at this banquet, he starts talking to the guy who threw the party. And so Jesus, he said also to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you." Now, all the people mentioned in that passage right there, the rich, the poor, the powerful, the weak, all those people, they're both image bearers, all of them. But Jesus says, invite the people who are poor and destitute and blind, the beggars, invite those people. Why? Because the lost world tells you to invite the powerful. The lost world says invite the people who are going to invite you back. You've got some motivation. You're inviting them because you stand to gain something. Jesus says you don't invite those people for those reasons. You invite the people who you stand nothing to gain by inviting. You invite the people who can't pay you back. And why do you do that? Because those people are image bearers too, and everybody else is trampling on them. Nobody else is honoring the image of God in that person. You do it. You invite them. That's why you do it. In James chapter 1, verse 27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Now, generally, as a rule, when you're visiting and caring for orphans and widows, you're not storing up favors, you're not lining your pockets, you're not gaining great notoriety for doing that, generally as a rule. But widows and orphans bear the image of God, and that simple fact dictates they must not be dismissed, forgotten, or trampled on. In the kingdom of God, we are called to love people for no other reason and with nothing else in mind than they bear the image of the God that we fear. And in the kingdom, there is a code of conduct that says you have to treat image bearers with a certain level of respect and dignity. There is a floor, there is a baseline that says no matter what they have done for you or what they have done to you or what they can do for you, you must conduct yourself like this towards them. I think one of the clearest examples of the importance of the motivations behind why we do things happens in the world of foster care. Because your motivations do matter. They will find you out. They do become clear. Now, the foster care system, it's messy, it's difficult, but there are families and people who will wade through the red tape, who will jump through all the hoops, and who will put themselves in a position that they know is probably going to cause a lot of heartache. It's going to be hard on them. It's going to logistically make their life more difficult, but they will do all of that anyway because they see a child who is an image bearer needing somebody to care for. And they say that kid needs somebody to treat them like they're worth something. Everybody else has forgotten them. They're downtrodden, but that kid's valuable and they need to know it. So I'll go through all the red tape. I'll jump through all the hoops. I will put myself in a position that I know is going to be hard on my heart so that I can help that kid because that kid is valuable. Unfortunately, there are also people who see foster care as a way to collect a check without having to get a real job. And they will see those kids and they will say, well, we'll take one of them in. But they do it not because they think that kid's valuable. They do it not because they think they want to show the kid the love of God. They do it because they see as a way to gain something for themselves. They want the check that the state is going to send because when you foster a kid, the state says, hey, we'll help you cover the expenses of that. And so that check comes to them, and the parents with crooked motivations, and instead of using that check to help care for the kids, it usually gets burned on the whims of the parents. Now, in both of those instances, those families have supposedly done the same thing, have they not? They have both went through the red tape, they've taken the same classes, jumped through the same hoops, they have both opened their home to a child in need, but it is not hard. I have seen this firsthand. Anybody else who's been around foster care has seen this firsthand. It is not hard to figure out what families are doing it for what reasons. It is not very difficult to spot the families who are doing it because they care about the kids and the families who are doing it because they care about the check. Pretty easy to figure that out. And the kids who are in homes where people care more about the check than they do the kids, the treatment that those kids deserve is heartbreaking. Because those people that take those kids in, that's not honoring the image of God in your neighbor. That's dishonoring to those kids. Because you're using an image bearer to gain something for yourself. They're nothing more than a tool that you are using to try and get something out of it. That is dishonoring to them. That is not treating others with respect and dignity. They're a means to an end. And so if you would like to know how you're doing with this whole fear of the Lord thing, then consider how you see and how you treat and why you treat your fellow man the way that you do. Especially in terms of the people who don't treat you well or have nothing to offer you in turn. Consider if you're sorting people into two groups and moving people back and forth. Because for people who fear God, that is not an option, and it is not acceptable. Those who fear God love their neighbor because their neighbor is made in the image of the God they fear. And how could we truly fear God and then treat poorly those who are made in his image? The whole duty of man, fear God, obey his commands. And his commands are to love God and love your neighbor. But God has not just simply handed these commands down to us from on high. And our God is exceedingly good. And so he's not just handed these down to us, he has shown us what it looks like to do this, to treat others with respect and dignity whenever they maybe don't even deserve it. And that leads us to this final principle. We treat other image bearers with justice and goodness because God has done so for us. We treat other image bearers with justice and goodness because God has done that for us. You know, duty, pretty good motivator. It's not the best motivator. And we started this series talking about this journey from dread to delight. And we're closing it here on talking about loving God, fearing God, loving our neighbors. And that duty and that fear of God should be enough to say, hey, you know, you ought to do this because you fear God and this is what he said. But God has gone even beyond that for us. And the devotion that gets stirred in our hearts whenever we see God as not just almighty and on high, but we also see him as just and merciful and good spurs us on. And there is no greater example of the justice, the mercy, the goodness of God all in one place, all at one time, than the cross. Romans 5, 6 through 7 says this, "For while we were still weak, At the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person. Though perhaps for a good person, one would dare even to die. But God showed his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were his enemies, Christ died for us. And since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. Now, if there is ever a clear example of what it looks like to treat people who can't earn it and don't deserve it with respect and dignity just because they're made in the image of God, the cross is that example. How God has dealt with us is that example. Because you consider, why would God do that? Why would Christ die for the ungodly? Why would he come and sacrifice himself for the people who were his enemies? Why would he do any of that? What does God stand to gain from this? Not much. Right? Not much. We can't pay him back for that. We can't earn that. We can't give back to him anything in return of even remotely equal value. God does not need anything from us. We cannot repay him. In fact, there's a whole lot of people who are created in his image, who are walking around, and who many of us, we all once were. We spit in his face and say, we don't need you, get out of our way. We don't want your offer of mercy. Move. And God still did this for us. Christ still went to the cross for us, even knowing that. And he did it because, as Pastor Steve said a few weeks back, Jesus didn't die on the cross to make us valuable. Jesus died on the cross because we are valuable. He honored the value that we have intrinsically as image bearers. God was not concerned with what he was going to get back. He was not concerned with if we were treating him with justice and goodness and mercy and with respect and dignity. If God had sorted people into these two groups, if he had done what we do all the time, and he had said, okay, here's all the people who deserve forgiveness. Here's all the people who can earn it. Here's all the people I stand to gain something by helping. That's this group. And he said, here's the other group of people who do not deserve it, who can't earn it, and I stand to gain nothing. Guess how many people are in this group? Nobody. Not one person, ever. One single solitary soul, not one. Everybody, all of us are over here in this group. Can't earn it, don't deserve it, can't pay him back, stands to gain nothing. And God is asking us and say, why don't you do for others what I've done for you? Why don't you love people and honor people and care for people, whether they're going to do that back for you or not? And how could we not? How can you not follow and obey a God like that, who upholds justice perfectly and yet is good and merciful to the lawbreakers, who treats us better than we deserve, who is willing to die for his enemies? I mean, if we even begin to wrap our heads around what Christ has done for us and the sacrifices that God has made on our behalf, that will begin, and it should begin, to form a very deep allegiance and devotion to God in our hearts. And that allegiance and that devotion to the God who has been so good to us will compel us to obey his commands. And obedience out of devotion and allegiance, that is a much deeper and richer obedience than simply doing it out of duty. God has not just handed these orders down from on high without knowing what it is to do this himself. He has done for us what he is asking us to do for other people. He has made sacrifices for people who can't and won't return the favor. He has fought and bled, and Christ has died for us. All of which ought to, and if we see it, should and will make us have a very deep devotion and allegiance for the God who has went so far to redeem us. And if you're looking for a place to start practically living like a God-fearing person, if you're saying, okay, well, if I'm going to be a God-fearing person, then I got to figure this loving my neighbor out and treating people with respect and dignity. If you want places to do that, then I've got some suggestions. Now, we're pretty serious around here about prison ministry because most people will write off and forget those who are behind bars. But even the people, our neighbors, our brothers and sisters behind bars, they bear the image of God. And Jesus died on the cross for them just like he did for you and me. And a lot of folks will treat them as subhuman, say they're not worth your time, forget them, which is why we need men and women who fear God to go to those men and women and tell them about the love of God so that they can come to know and love Christ and trust in him as their Savior. And so if you want to love your neighbors behind bars, there's a few different ways you can do that. The first of which is to be on one of our teams that actually goes and ministers to the inmates. All right, we've got several different folks and teams in several different jails and prisons who go and lead church services and meet with the inmates because we want to show them that, the gospel is for them too. What Christ did on the cross is for them too. And so if you are interested in saying, hey, I want to love my neighbors behind bars, you can come talk to me after the service. You can go out in the lobby at the gray counter and we'll get your name and number and we'll get in touch with you. The other way, which I told first service about, but they took this to heart, we've got an angel tree program. Some of you are probably involved with that, but our angel tree program is about loving our neighbors. That's us trying to provide gifts for kids of inmates for Christmas who are probably not going to have anything under the tree unless somebody like us steps in. Their parents have made some pretty bad decisions, but those kids are image bearers and they still matter. And the Angel Tree program is a way for us to say, we have not forgotten you. We are not treating you with disdain. We want to honor you and we want to help you have Christmas. And if none of those tickle your fancy and you think, well, I don't really want to work in that realm, that's not really for me. How about our foster advocacy ministry? It's a ministry where we're trying to build communities around these families who are fostering, because there are tons of kids out there who are treated and who feel worthless, and they need somebody to come along and treat them like they have value. And so we have got people in our church who said, we care about the kid, not the check. We want to do this. We want to love on these kids. We want to provide them a great home. We want to teach them about the love of Christ. We want to do those things. And so our foster advocacy ministry says, we know not everybody can foster. If you can foster, that's awesome. We encourage you to do that. But not everybody can. But what we can do, everybody can do something. And so our ministry here is to say, we're going to rally around the families who are on the front lines. We're going to build communities around the families who are taking in these kids, and we're going to help them deal with the logistical challenges and some of the emotional hardship of being involved in foster care, so that those families can provide a loving home where those kids grow to know and love Christ and who feel like they're worth something because they are. And so if you want to help a family who's sticking their neck out for the kids in need, maybe our foster ministry where you need to be. And if none of those seem to really tickle your fancy and none of those really work for you, then we've got tons of other options too. We've got people who go into nursing homes every week and who minister and do church services and who talk with the folks in the nursing homes, because a lot of our society will say, just write those people off and forget them. They can't help you. They're not going to pay you back. There's nothing you gain from that. Forget them. They're still image bearers too. Just because they need a little help doesn't mean they're not valuable. We've got people who we're getting ready to send Joe and Abby, Penny and Chloe to South Africa. Why? Because the people in South Africa are image bearers and our neighbors too. And so we want to care for them. Just because they're across the world doesn't mean we can say, well, forget them, let somebody else do it. They don't matter. That's across the world. What do you want me? Joe and Abby are going to go to try to make a difference because there are image bearers and we have neighbors in South Africa. So maybe you want to help them. We have got people in our church who are really involved with the Right to Life program, which says we fight for the rights of the unborn. We got people in our church who say, if there is anybody who is treated like they are worth nothing, it is the unborn in this country. A huge part of our culture says, if that kid's an inconvenience, doesn't mean anything, get rid of it, has no value. That is not true. The unborn are image bearers just like you and I were, and they deserve to be treated as such. And so we've got people in our church who fight for the rights of the unborn. And we're getting ready to kick off our Christmas offering, where we help the orphans in Cambodia, because, again, the orphans in Cambodia, they live in a culture and their religion in that part of the world says, if you've been dealt a bad hand, that's just, the higher power. They don't believe in the God of the Bible, but their God, they say, well, why would I treat you better than our God would? If you're down, I'll kick you while you're down. I'm not helping you. And so those orphans need somebody to reach across the world and say, no, those are image bearers. You can't treat them like that. They deserve to be treated with respect and with dignity because they bear the image of the God who we fear. And so maybe you want to help support the orphans and the church orphan homes in Cambodia. There are lots of ways for you to do this. But if we're going to consider ourselves people who fear God, then that must be reflected in how we treat those who are made in His image. And we do that. We treat others well because God has done that for us. He has done it first.